Yeah, well, it's bad because there's a place you can fall off on the back.
Okay, well, done that at CFO.
I've had,
I'm
sure
I'm-
conferences here.
I'm
Occasionally
too,
we've had people do
I'm
it
afraid,
fall off.
afraid to ask you guys to move an inch either way.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
You need more space?
Bench here, really.
Yeah, oh, that would be even more fun.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Alex Pollock of the R Street Institute, and it's a great pleasure for Desmond LACHMAN and me to welcome you to our conference on Brexit after the United Kingdom election. Let me begin with a slightly amended quotation. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for the British people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with the European Union and to resume among the powers of the earth a separate and equal station, what then? Well, for a start, there's a lot of discussion, contentious debates, sometimes some pretty hot and emotional rhetoric, and competing economic forecasts of either disaster or prosperity. You might say a different kind of battle of Britain. And then, of course, we had another election which delivered another surprising result. Bringing us to today's questions on Brexit for our speakers. First, predictions. What will happen now and over the course of the next year or two? And second, recommendations. What should happen now? These may be considered from the perspectives of at least the UK, the European Union, with implications for its future development, and the United States. What does this mean for us? Our panel today promises to be a most interesting and lively exploration of the many and contestable issues, and let me introduce our distinguished panelists in the order in which they will speak. John Bolton, Senior Fellow at AEI, focuses on U.S. foreign and national security policy. He served as the U.S. Permanent Representative to the United Nations and as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security. John is known as an outspoken advocate of the U.S. national interests, among many issues working vigorously against North Korea's nuclear weapons program. Neither has John been timid and shy on Brexit. He will be our first speaker, and he does have to leave at noon, so we'll excuse him as he slips out at that point. Our second speaker will be David O'Sullivan, who is ambassador of the European Union delegation to the United States, where he oversees the EU's bilateral relationships with the U.S. Previously, he was chief operating officer of the European External Action Service and responsible for establishing this new EU diplomatic service, Secretary General of the European Commission, Director General for Trade, and responsible for the launch of a number of free trade agreements, and maybe there'll be another such a free trade agreement to launch here with Brexit. Third will be Adam Posen, the president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Adam has written extensively about the financial and economic challenges faced by the European Union, as well as Japan's economic crisis and monetary and fiscal policies in the G7. He served for 3 years as an external voting member of the Bank of England's rate-setting monetary policy committee, where he advocated an activist policy response to the financial crisis. But I think it's fair to say, Adam, you've not been an active advocate for Brexit.
Correct.
Then we will hear from HUGO GURDON, the editorial director of the Washington Examiner, who has described himself as having been in favor of a British exit from the EU for more than 20 years. Previously, he was editor-in-chief of The Hill, Washington bureau chief for the Daily Telegraph of London, and managing editor of the National Post of Canada, and his writing has also appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Financial Times, and The Guardian. Our last speaker will be Desmond LACHMAN, who's been a resident fellow at AEI since 2003, focused on the global macroeconomy. Desmond writes extensively on international economics, including ongoing strains in the euro area, which includes Brexit, financial crises, currencies, continuing travails of Greece and Puerto Rico. Previously, he was managing director and Chief Emerging Market Strategist at Solomon Smith Barney and a Deputy Director at the International Monetary Fund, and he has done a great job of organizing this conference. Thank you, Desmond. Each panelist is going to speak from 12 to 15 minutes. After that, we'll give them a chance to react to each other's views or to clarify points of their own, and then we will open the floor to your questions, and we will adjourn promptly at 12:30. And John, you have the floor.
Great. Well, thanks very much, Alex. Welcome back. My thanks to Des for putting this program together, which I think is very important. Thanks to other colleagues on the panel for showing up, and thanks to all of you in the audience and who are watching the live stream. I wanted to deal with a couple of myths about Brexit and kind of where we stand after the June 8 election in the United Kingdom, obviously from the U.S. perspective as I see it. And the first thing I think it's important to understand is the myth that somehow the June 8 election in the UK had much, if anything, to do about Brexit, or that the outcome of that election tells us very much really about the UK strategy going forward. Really, the only party that felt strongly about Brexit in the election were the Liberal Democrats. They rocketed all the way up from 8 seats in the House of Commons to 12. Interestingly, their percentage of the national vote went down from 7.9% to 7.4%. I'd hardly call that a ringing endorsement of a second view of the British referendum on Brexit. I think what was really at stake was this was a terrible tactical call by Theresa May. Terrible. Probably running the worst campaign in living memory in any Western democracy. And rather than the Conservatives picking up a substantial number of seats, they went down, although interestingly, their national share of the popular vote went from 36.8% to 42.3%. Obviously, the key here was the collapse of the UK Independence Party, which lost its only seat and dropped in its nationwide share of the vote from 12.6% to 1.8%. That party is effectively finished. And what happened was many of its prior adherents returned to the Conservative Party, but even more importantly, returned to the Labour Party, thus allowing Jeremy Corbyn to gain 30 seats and go up 9.6% in the national vote. There are two reasons for that, I think. First, unfortunately, socialism still works. You promise to give things away to people for free. They vote for you. He says, why not forgive college tuitions? And like lemmings to the cliff, away they went voting for him. But also because of the collapse of UKIP, demonstrating that a lot of its support did come from Labour. I think that was clear in the referendum last year. If you looked at the allocation of Leave votes and the percentages in traditional Labour constituencies, but fundamentally this was Labour voters coming back and millennials voting in their own self-interest. You know, one of the comments made about Brexit, one of the arguments against voting to leave to begin with was, good grief, if UK leaves the European Union, the United Kingdom itself will dissolve. And I think curiously, maybe not so curiously, this election a few weeks ago put to the end the possibility of Scottish secession from the United Kingdom, as the SNP, the Scottish National Party, lost 21 seats in Parliament and lost over a third of its vote. I'm predominantly Scotch-Irish. I like to say my ancestors left before the madness set in. But one clear fact here is that Scottish withdrawal, I think, is off the table for the foreseeable future. So I wouldn't read much of anything into the reason why people voted as they did in the June 8 election. I obviously don't deny that a reallocation of seats in Parliament will have implications politically, but I just don't think they were intended to be related to Brexit. And this ties into the second myth I wanted to talk about, the enduring feeling by many people in the UK and Europe and in the United States that Brexit can be reversed. It is not going to happen. It is not going to happen. I think this was a vote against distant, arbitrary, unaccountable power. That's why I didn't realize Alex was going to read a paraphrase of the Declaration of Independence, but that's much the same thing. Brussels, to a majority of the British people, was the George III that we saw, and that's what they voted on. And we can have a discussion about why this accretion of power in Brussels is contrary to basic theory of representative government, that eventually the holders of power are so distant from the people who hold the legitimacy of power that the people lose faith in the system of governance. And I think that's basically what motivated a majority of the British to leave. And that has not changed. I think the hidden story here, of course, is that within the European Union itself, although EU leaders don't like to say it, they see it the same way. And that's why they're so worried about the precedent that Brexit sets possibly for others. There is a theology about the European Union, a secular theology that basically holds no rational person can disagree with the idea that the European Union is a good thing. That's why the UK's heresy is so serious and so threatening. And that's why many leaders in the UK are driven to say the blasphemers must be punished. That goes to another myth that's important in the EU's psychology, and that is that politics has really always been more important for the proponents of ever closer union than economics. Although in the United States for decades, people thought of the common market. They said, what a fine thing, who can be against reducing barriers to trade and tariffs? A continental-sized market obviously has worked for us. It will work for the Brits. And many people in Europe thought that's what they were getting into as well. I think many people in Britain thought, common market, who can possibly object to that? It was certainly Margaret Thatcher's view as a young politician that that's what they were signing up for. And this comes from the ideology or theology that the nation state was responsible for 2 world wars in Europe, and that the elimination of the nation state is the way to eliminate war. I think that's nonsense, but I think that's part of the theology, and it's reflected today in something that I think also was rejected by the Brits, and that is that the European Union is responsible for peace and security on the European continent. You can hear EU parliamentarians say this all the time. Somehow the North Atlantic Treaty Organization gets lost in the shuffle. It doesn't seem to figure in their rhetoric. But the fact is, and I think this is widely viewed this way in Britain, certainly in the United States, the European Union has not made Europe politically stronger in the world. In fact, I would say the EU has made Europe less than the sum of its parts. And it's something that is very much on American and British minds. We can see it. We can see the potential consequences even as recently as just after the G7 meeting, when Chancellor Merkel of Germany said, and so all I can say is that we Europeans must really take our destiny into our own hands. Now, what does that mean from a security point of view? What does that mean for the British? What does that mean for the Americans? Typically, European Union actions on security policy are to declare a grand policy of pan-European security and then not provide the resources. You know, we've been having this debate that some find pretty painful about NATO members contributing 2% of their gross domestic product in terms to the common defense through their own defense expenditures. France, for example, provides 1.8%, close. Germany provides 1.2%. Estonia and Poland both provide over 2%. The UK provides 2.2%. The US spends 3.6% of its GDP. So Chancellor Merkel, go ahead and take Europe's destiny into your own hands and tell me what you're going to increase your defense expenditures to. This is the sort of argument that I think played very poorly in Great Britain. I think it is reflected certainly in the Conservative Party's leadership, those who advocated leave. And it's something they will be thinking about even if it's not on the negotiation table with the European Union negotiators in the Brexit negotiations. Now, what is going to be the outcome of the Brexit negotiations? Honestly, we don't know. I believe that what you hear now from European Union leaders are the statements of the European Union's political class, that by God, these uppity peasants in Britain, need to be put in their place. And by the way, the uppity peasants in other European countries that may be thinking the same things need to be shown what the consequences will be for them as well. Now, you know, if the European Union negotiators do follow this essentially punitive course, they should understand it's like a beggar thy neighbor policy in trade. There may well be costs, maybe substantial costs, that will be imposed on Britain economically as a cost of the Brexit decision. But those costs will be felt on the other side in Europe as well. This has been reflected by any number of statements from things like the German Federation of Business and many others who have said, for goodness sakes, negotiate their exit, but don't disturb the commercial, financial relationships that we have. It benefits German people, it benefits German citizens. Don't overturn any of this. I don't know who will prevail and what I think will be a struggle between the EU's political class and its business class, but I think that will ultimately be the decider as to how they negotiate. I will just say this: I think that if it is perceived in Britain that the EU is pursuing a punitive strategy, that will strongly reinforce the view that the leave vote was exactly the right thing to do. The British are not going to be cowed by tough terms. You can put that myth aside as well. Now, within the British government, while I think Theresa May's tenure is dubious at best, I think the strategy for British negotiations will be controlled by the leave side of the equation. However narrow the margin in Parliament is, they are the people who drove this through, and ultimately they will be the ones in charge. It will be trimmed by political constraints, but I think they're prepared for a hard Brexit. They may not want it, but the decision, as I said before, in their minds is far more a political decision, a declaration of independence from the European Union, than it was an economic decision. And I think as well, this then brings in the potential role of the United States. And I think I can safely say under the Trump administration, there is a 180-degree difference in the view of Brexit than there was in the Obama administration. Obama famously goes to Britain before the referendum last year and says, well, if you vote to leave, you're going to be at the back of the queue. Back of the queue being a real American expression. Right? So you know who wrote his talking point on that one. And I think that had a negative effect on the British public. Just as I mentioned a moment ago, I think a punitive negotiation strategy of the EU would. But I can tell you in the Trump administration, I think the White House will come to Britain's aid. I think there's every chance here to write the right kind of free trade agreement between the United Kingdom and the United States. I think Canada could be brought into this at a very early opportunity. Now, the EU lawyers will say, oh, but they can't do that until the 2 years have passed and they've negotiated an exit. Guess what? The United States is not bound by the European Union treaties. We can negotiate with anybody who wants to negotiate with us. And I think there are a lot of things that can be done from the perspective of declarations of principles about what a free trade agreement would be, even if the Brits didn't simply junk the whole procedural mechanism of the exit. So I remain optimistic about Brexit. I went to Britain to be there on June the 23rd last year just to be part of a historical moment. It was a declaration of independence, and I wish the British every success. Thank you.
Thanks, John. David.
Follow that, huh? Thank you very much, Alex. Thank you very much to the AEI for the opportunity to be here. Thank you for the colleagues on the panel for their participation as well. Look, I should firstly perhaps issue a sort of standard health warning. I represent the European Union. I do not speak on behalf of the British government, and I cannot speak to the intentions of the British government or the consequences of their election for obvious reasons. But I will pick up some of the points maybe that John made a little later. You may not be surprised to hear that. But let's just deal with what we know. What we know is that on the 23rd of June, Britain held a consultative referendum about whether they wished to leave or remain in the European Union. By 52% to 48%, they voted to leave. By the way, they voted to leave a union which they had voluntarily joined. which I think is somewhat different from the situation of the Declaration of Independence. And a union on which they had already held a referendum in 1975 to further consolidate that decision as to whether they would join, and which always contained the possibility of leaving. So we're such a rigid union. We don't even allow. We actually allow the possibility that people might actually want to leave. Something that you don't actually allow under your own constitution, as I understand. You may have even had some difficulties of a local nature in the 19th century over that subject. So they are perfectly entitled under Article 50 to say that they wish to leave. We deeply regret that. I'll come back to that maybe a little later. I say that as someone who's been involved with the European project for most of my career, and particularly as an Irishman, because I think that it has huge consequences for the relationship between the United Kingdom and Ireland, between Northern Ireland and Ireland. And I regret that in many of the debates in the UK, perhaps those consequences were not fully integrated into the discussion. It tended to be a very inward-looking discussion. But I understand that. We respect the decision. We're saddened by it. I think it's a blow for the EU that the UK decides to leave. I think it's the wrong decision for them, but they're perfectly entitled to make it, and they will go their own way. And we have a very clearly established procedure by which we now go forward, which is a 2-year period over which we negotiate the departure of the United Kingdom from the EU. That bit is actually not that difficult. I mean, you essentially airbrush the UK out of the European treaties. But as people are realizing, 44 years of deep involvement with the European Union has meant deep, deep ties between the United Kingdom and the 27 other member states, covering a range of areas that people are only beginning to sort of still understand the full implications of this, going from, supplies for nuclear power plants to aviation agreements to the complexity of regulatory management of pharmaceutical products and so forth. And every day, frankly, in the course of going through this, our teams discover a further complexity that needs to be one way or another sorted out. The European Union, I think, has been extremely transparent. We've appointed a chief negotiator. The Council has adopted negotiating guidelines. These are publicly available, and we have committed to putting all our papers on this issue on the net and making it fully available in a very transparent way. I want to correct one thing, and I think it's extremely important. There is nothing punitive in the approach of the European Union to this process. This is not something that the EU is doing to the UK. This is something that the UK has chosen to do to itself and to the rest of the EU. They have opted to leave. We therefore have to deal with what the consequences of that are. And I think it would be extremely naive to imagine that you can be part of the largest single market in the world, the biggest trading bloc in the world, one of the richest and most successful peace projects in the history of mankind, and that you can walk out the door with no consequences, or that you can walk out the door and carry on as though you were still a member. There is a difference between being a member of the European Union and not being a member of the European Union. That is why we have so many people queuing up to want to join the European Union. And getting into the European Union is actually quite a complicated and difficult process where we have rather demanding positions which we expect of countries that would eventually want to join. So leaving has consequences. And I think this was always made clear to the United Kingdom, and it will have consequences. Now, the process which has been set out over the 2 years is firstly to deal with a number of upfront issues, which cover firstly the issue of the rights of EU citizens living in the UK and UK citizens living in the rest of Europe, because we've had effectively a more or less seamless movement of people across Europe, and there will be consequences when the UK leaves, and we would like to understand what those consequences will be and how we provide guarantees for those people who moved in good faith with their families, with their jobs, and how they are going to be treated in the post-Brexit world. Secondly, there is the issue of financial responsibilities. We have a multi-annual budget process in the European Union. Our budget is relatively modest. It's only 1% of the GDP of the European Union. But still, we fund important projects, many of which are agreed over a 7 to 10 year period. We need to understand how those financial commitments will be maintained post-Brexit, because the UK signed up to those finances and that money, and we need to understand how we will deal with that going forward. And the other issue, of course, is the issue of frontiers, particularly between Northern Ireland and Ireland, but there are other frontier issues as well. So those are 3 issues which we believe need to be addressed early on in the negotiations. In a second phase, we should look at what the new relationship would be. There are a number of options that one could imagine. I think Paul Simon said there are 50 ways to leave your lover. I don't know if there are 50 ways to Brexit, but there are certainly a number of forms of Brexit which you could imagine. What we understand from what has been said by the UK until now, they envisage a fairly strict form of Brexit, which is leaving the single market, leaving the customs union, and they would wish to renegotiate the trade relationship with the EU via a comprehensive free trade agreement. Fine. If that is the wish, that is going to take many, many years to negotiate. I'm a veteran trade negotiator. I negotiated the EU-South Korea trade agreement in 2.5 years, but I can tell you we did that on the back of an excellent template already agreed between the US negotiators and my South Korean counterparts. Most trade agreements of a comprehensive nature take longer. We've just concluded and will enter into force on the 21st of September, a very comprehensive, probably one of the most comprehensive trade agreements ever agreed between industrialized countries with Canada, and that took nearly 8 years. And that was between two very like-minded partners. We are about to conclude with Japan, and that took probably about six to 7 years, and by the time it's finally ratified and signed and done and dusted, it'll probably be closer to 7 or 8 years as well. That's the kind of time frame a comprehensive trade deal takes. And you cannot simply replicate the seamless membership of the single market which comes with membership of the European Union, where everything is governed by single sets of European regulations, which you don't require trade negotiations, and that's precisely why we have the European Union. So it's not bilateral trade deals, it is the creation of a single economic and commercial space. You cannot reproduce that in a trade deal very easily. You can't simply cut and paste what's in the treaties and put them into a trade negotiation. It doesn't work like that. So we know that's going to take a number of years, and that brings me to the third phase of the negotiation, which is going to be some form of transition. Again, we don't know what the UK precisely wishes for this transition. It will be very much for them to say what kind of transition they would like to see between the moment they will leave, which is fixed as the 2 years after the 29th of March 2017, so the 29th of March 2019, they will exit. It'll take us, certainly 5-6 years to negotiate a comprehensive trade deal. What do we do in the meantime? And how do we manage the multiple complexities that would result from the UK crashing out of the single market and the European Union on the 30th of March 2019? There needs to be some kind of transition. Again, we wait to see what it is that the UK wants. Again, there are many different formulae. There's the Norway European Economic Area formula. There's the Swiss formula. There are different ways we can look at this, but we do need to find some solution to this transitional issue. And so this is where we are. I want to emphasize that there is absolutely no sense of punishment or no sense of vindictiveness. We are disappointed the UK is leaving. We want a good relationship with the UK. We want a good trading relationship. We want a good security and defense relationship and counterterrorism relationship. But all of this is going to be infinitely more complicated to manage than it was when the UK was an integral part of the European Union. That's a fact. That is why we're in the European Union. That is why we have invested in building this remarkable project. And what I would just like to emphasize that for the rest of us, the 27, we are going to continue with this process. And I, frankly, John, vigorously reject your vision of the European Union. And I say that as a European citizen and as someone who has seen what the European Union has done for my continent. The European Union is fundamentally a project of peace, freedom, and prosperity. I don't deny that other factors may have contributed to peace in Europe, including NATO, including the transatlantic. I don't deny that. But the fact is the reconciliation between the warring factions of the first half of the 20th century was largely a process of the European Union and what we built together. And I say that as an Irishman because I believe that the peace process in Northern Ireland was largely a product of joint membership of the European Union by the United Kingdom and the Republic of Ireland. We were able to build a new reality on the island of Ireland which recognized the rights of the Unionists to guarantee to live within the United Kingdom unless there was a change by the majority. At the same time, the fact that the border in practice no longer existed because we were both part of the European Union, the nationalists could feel they were living on a single island. And we squared the impossible circle which had led to unconscionable violence and atrocities over 30 years. It's just one illustration. The fact is we've had 70 years of peace on the European continent, you have to go back to the 16th century to find an equivalent period of no conflict between the major powers. And that is, in large measure, a contribution of the European Union. We have built freedom. The European Union has guaranteed the values of democracy, of human rights, and the rule of law. We provided a shelter for Greece when they emerged from the dictatorship of the colonels, for Spain and Portugal from Franco and Salazar, and after the collapse of communism, we provided a magnetic north and a safe haven for the emerging countries of Central and Eastern Europe. I don't think that the European Union can claim credit for the fall of the Berlin Wall. I do believe that we can take credit for the fact that the fall of the Berlin Wall did not result in chaos and violence and confusion, but rather the orderly transition to the vibrant democracies that we now see as members of the European Union. And finally, prosperity, because yes, there is no country in the European Union that is not better off today than it was when it joined the European Union. I can say that for my own country. I can say that for even a country like Greece, which is suffering huge hardship at the present time because of the economic difficulties that we all know. But the fact is, Greece is an infinitely different place. I was just there recently, and I can tell you, I used to visit Greece in the early 70s. There's no comparison, even Greece suffering and having its economic difficulties. And the same is true for every country in Europe. You look at somewhere like Poland and compare its position now to, say, Ukraine, and you can compare the trajectory of countries which have joined the European Union and those which have not. So I absolutely think that the European Union has been a vastly successful project. The 27 will continue. It is not about abolishing the member state. It is not about abolishing national interest or nationality. It is the squaring of that circle, the reconciliation of multiple layers of identity. I'm from Dublin. I'm Irish. I'm European. There's no contradiction between these different levels of identity. But I know that Ireland on its own cannot manage in this 21st century. Not even a country like Germany can manage on its own in the 21st century. We will be stronger and more effective when we pool sovereignty and work together in the interests of our people. We will still, the most things that you want to do in your country will be decided at the national level. Your healthcare system, your education system, your economic system. Look at the difference between the economies of our countries across the 27 member states. Countries which are highly deregulated, countries which have high tax systems, and countries which have low tax systems. There is no uniformity here. There is no imposition of a single model. People continue to have their national identity, but we do that in a world which is vastly different in the 21st century to that which we lived through in the first half of the 20th century, with 2 world wars and the Holocaust as our responsibility. So we will continue on that direction. We will continue to develop and grow. We will try to have the best possible relationship with the United Kingdom, but that will also depend in large measure on what exactly the United Kingdom wants for itself in a post-Brexit future. And I notice that there's a continuing debate in the UK about how that's going to look, and we will respectfully wait for them to let us know how they want to take this relationship forward. There will be no punishment, but there is a difference between being a member of the European Union and being outside of the European Union, and that is what we will have to deal with. Thank you.
Thanks very much, David. Adam.
Well, good morning, and my thanks to Desmond and to Alex for having me here. As was mentioned in the introduction, I spent 3 years as a policymaker at the Bank of England, so I am here to provide the economics, at least that's how I view it, of what this will do to the UK and therefore how this affects the relationships with the US and with the EU. I very much agree with a number of Ambassador Sullivan's comments, but I just want to start where he started. I think it's the wrong decision for the UK, but they're entitled to it. So the question is, what happens as a result of making that decision? I like to think of AEI as the place inspired by people mugged by reality. Some of you will remember that famous Irving Kristol quote. And I fear that both several people in Britain and some people on this panel are either in the process of or about to be mugged by reality. The UK definitely had a long-standing ambivalence about membership in Europe, and there is no question that part of the European project and written in the laws is the idea of an ever closer union. And so there was this happy ambivalent state, happy in the sense it was the best anybody was going to do, of the UK being sort of in, sort of out. And that worked well, pretty well, for everybody. But it was not a sustainable equilibrium. It was not a sustainable equilibrium once the euro area became a majority of the member states. It was not a sustainable equilibrium once the foreign policy arm of the EU started to develop more coherence. And it was not a stable equilibrium because there was a cultural current, we can get into why and how, but recurrent throughout Britain and particularly in England, that the EU was a problem, much the same way people decided in this country Washington was a problem. And so this was not going to last. And so we now do have the break. And what are the implications? Well, the implication is very simple. The UK economy is going to suffer what we call a negative supply shock, and in fact is already doing so. What is a negative supply shock? A negative supply shock means you are reducing the productive capacity of your economy or the ability of your economy to purchase things for the same amount of money as you used to. And this takes several forms. Fundamentally, and again, this is something that I would hope in AEI would be religion. It is across the street at my shop. Putting up trade barriers is bad for your economy. The withdrawal from the EU is a form of putting up trade barriers. Full stop. Now, you can debate how much, how big, which industries, what happens in the end, but it is a withdrawal. Moreover, and this relates to some of the things Ambassador O'Sullivan said, it is a negative supply shock in that you are ruining your competitiveness specifically with your largest trading partner. It is a fact of life. It's one of the few things in economics we can talk about as a fact of life, that gravity applies. What is gravity? You trade far, far more with the countries you are contiguous with and the countries that you historically have interacted with than with countries that are far away. That is true for the US in the context of NAFTA. That is true for the UK. No matter how much there's been a special relationship, no matter how much the UK tries to be a global exporter, the fact is you've got more than twice as much trade with the EU, more than twice as much investment with the EU as you do with the US, or let alone the rest of the world. As David Cameron pointed out when Prime Minister while I was at the Bank of England, the UK does more trade with Ireland than they do with the BRIC countries combined, Brazil, Russia, India, and China. So this is negative, full stop. And even if we were to get the kind of UK-US trade deal that Ambassador Bolton puts forward, I don't think we will, and I'll explain that at the very end if we have time, but even if we were, it would not matter very much compared to this shock. Additionally, because the UK had this special status as the less regulated, less low-tax, English-speaking, rule of law place, not that all of that was in question elsewhere in the EU, and certainly Ireland was similar, but had this special place, and people liked living in London, you had a huge amount of investment in the UK as a platform to enter the EU because you were part of the EU deal. That goes away. It may not go to zero. It will gradually come down. I see a representative, for example, of Toyota Motor Corporation here. Toyota, Nissan, Ford all have disproportionate amounts of their European auto production in the UK. All have indicated that they will not expand those production, will probably decline those production points in the UK when the UK loses full market access. Fourth, there's a distinction that gets made, and it was sort of there in Ambassador Bolton, and it was more there in Ambassador O'Sullivan's comments, which is important. There's a distinction between a trade deal and access to the single market. The single market is covering all those things that aren't simply the price of goods off the boat. It's whether your auto meets safety standards. It's whether your chemicals or your food additives have been recognized. It's whether you fit standard sizes of various objects. It's whether your accountants are accredited. It's whether your university degree is recognized in other countries' universities. Now, there's a large body of research in the US and Europe, some of it written at AEI, that says many of these things are restraints from trade. In reality, they are partially restraints from trade and partially economically beneficial because they set standards and make it easier to have large markets. In any given industry, there'll be more or less of those attributes. But so then the question is, since the UK primarily is an exporter of high-end products and of services especially, financial services, business services, media services, cultural services, educational services, how much do they lose by not being in the single market, even if you have a trade deal? And the answer is a lot. Most of the financial regulation that affected the UK was set in the UK and was not set by Brussels. And while the UK was in the EU, they had a predominant voice in the setting of those regulations in Brussels. Now, there will be no such interest. And that is why we are seeing, on estimates of my colleague Simeon Jankov, who runs the financial markets group at the London School of Economics, a third of city jobs, the economic and financial jobs in the City of London, will be moving to Dublin, Frankfurt, New York. So, full stop, this is bad economically. Now you can say, but this is for centuries. Over the long term, it'll be better. So then you have to think about what's wrong with the EU economy versus the UK economy. So most of us who see there being problems in the EU economy as a whole, or at least the Euro area economy, because frankly Eastern Europe isn't doing so bad, tend to focus on 5 things. We say there's over-regulation of labor markets, there's heavy-handed regulation in other things, there's an excessive welfare state, there's demographic decline, and there's the problems of being associated with the Euro membership. Now, if you look at that list, 4 of those 5 do not apply to the UK, even as members of the EU. The UK has a looser labor market regulations than anyone else in the EU. The UK has a smaller welfare state than anyone else in the EU. The UK was a beneficiary in a demographic sense of people from Poland and France and Portugal and elsewhere and Romania coming and helping balance out the aging of their society. And the UK was, of course, not a member of the European monetary system. Even if the UK were to stay in the EU, none of that would change. So what is it getting? So you're balancing essentially non-financial regulation in certain areas being excessive versus all the other stuff I spoke about, and giving up the ability to affect or push back against those regulations in future because you will no longer be a member. Leave the rhetoric aside. Look at the reality. This is not a very good deal in economic terms. Now, again, you can always say, well, this is about sovereignty. They want to do it. Again, I'm not fit to say that. That's fine. But you should be aware that there is no economic upside to this. So let me just be predictive in my remaining 3.5 minutes. What's going to happen? I agree with Ambassador Bolton that there is no going back right now in the UK. There is the election was not about Brexit. I completely agree with him on that. What is perhaps ironic for people to understand is the real reason the election was not about Brexit and there's no turnaround on Brexit is not because of anything to do with the Tory government. It's to do with the fact that the current extreme left-wing leadership of the Labour Party is horribly anti-Europe. Corbyn and McDonnell are viscerally anti-Europe. Corbyn voted against the European Union back in '74 and consistently since. Again, that's his right. But if the Labour leadership were different, you could have a Remain vote, come back, as long as the Labour leadership is these 2 nut jobs, and it will remain these 2 nut jobs for the foreseeable future, run by the unions, you will not see a Remain vote. So the UK is going to have to cope with this economic aspect. They're going to have higher inflation, lower purchasing power, weaker pound. The pound has a ways to go yet because it mostly declined against the dollar, where, as I mentioned, there's more than twice as much trade and investment with Europe as with the dollar, so it has to adjust further against Europe. As my colleague, Lord Mervyn King, from the bank, then governor of the Bank of England, used to point out, the UK had a huge set of imbalances. The UK has very large budget deficits, has very large trade deficits. At some point, that means they're living beyond their savings, they have to pay it back. Well, what we've seen over the last few years and in the run-up since the Brexit is that we've seen a further boost of consumer borrowing while corporate investment has gone negative and trade has gone the wrong way. So in other words, the household balance sheets are getting worse, the government balance sheet is getting worse, the trade balance sheet is getting worse, at the same time that they are now going to be pulling themselves out of economies of scale in their biggest markets. And at the same time that there is inflation, which means the real purchasing power and ability to pay off those debts is going to go down. Not good. Do the mental exercise. If this was 1974 Britain, and you were on a fixed exchange rate and you had this set of macroeconomic indicators, you would be predicting a pound crash. Thankfully, Great Britain, UK, is not part of the euro area, does not have a fixed exchange rate. But if you do that exercise, it reminds you of just how unsustainable the current British path is. So then you have to go further into being mugged by reality. In this game, given that economic situation, what does the UK do? Well, the Theresa May government has made very clear that they intend to try to become Singapore on the Thames. They want to become the city-state alternative to the overregulated Europe. There are a dozen problems with this, but I will highlight one in particular. That Theresa May came out repeatedly saying, well, the way we're going to get around these immigration restrictions, which we're going to put in place, we're going to make it hard for EU people to have secured citizenship in the UK, we're going to control our borders, you know that phrase, and not let all this cheap labor and foreigners and Eastern Europeans in. But yet, all of business is really mad about this. Well, we're going to start allocating on an industry by industry, if not company by company basis, through our government, permits of who gets how many immigrants in which industry for the rest of the time. Again, this should be anathema to anyone in this building in AEI. It certainly is anathema to any market economist. Basically, this is the labor market program of the pre-Thatcher industrial policies of the Labour Party in the 70s and the 60s, which Theresa May wants to reimpose on the British economy. So don't entertain the fantasy that this is going to make Britain this wonderful, like Hong Kong was in the 70s. It's going to make Britain like Britain was in the 70s. That is a step backward. That is a step away from freedom. That is a step away from prosperity. Again, as we've seen repeatedly, and not just in this country, popular votes at any given time can select things that are in bad self-interest. And political factors can rightly overcome economic concerns. But let us not mistake what are the actual economic implications of Brexit. And finally, I'll end on the fact of also what are the values. Because as people at AEI have repeatedly argued, rightly, the arguments for free markets are not just about economic efficiency, as Arthur Brooks has pointed out. They're about morality, they're about openness, they're about interchange with other peoples, they're about foreign policy. The people who voted for Brexit and the choices they are making to emphasize border control and symbolism of the European Court of Justice is an ideology that is about what we call in Britain Little England. It is an ideology that is ethno-nationalist. It is an ideology that distrusts free markets and competition. It is an ideology that distrusts change. Again, they have the right to do this, but do not kid yourself about what the values are. They are not values anything anyone in this building should support.
Thank you, Adam. Hugo.
Thanks very much for being here, and thank you for inviting me. I have, as the introduction suggested, been in favor of Brexit for 20 years or more and continue to support it. But the first thing I want to do is something which perhaps most Leave voters would not be expected to do, and that is to pay tribute to the magnificence of the European Union project. I think I can do that best by reference to a rather well-known photograph of President Francois Mitterrand and Chancellor Helmut Kohl at the Verdun Battlefield Memorial in 1984, where they held each other's hand. And it's seen as it's a kind of an icon of European reconciliation. And the European Union is, to a great extent, the architecture of that reconciliation. And this, I think, is the way that the French and the Germans and a lot of continental Europeans regard it. And in regarding it in that way, it is an admirable project. But that is not the way that it has been regarded in Britain, where it has been principally about economics and democracy and the interplay of those things. The references to the American Declaration of Independence, with the caveats added by Mr. O'Sullivan, are nevertheless worth referring to. The founding fathers in the Declaration of Independence was couched in a list of grievances about traditional freedoms of Englishmen, which were being trammeled and withdrawn by a central power. And the British are steeped in history and indeed in some myths that go all the way back to ancient Saxon times about freedoms and democracy and suspicion of central power. And it needs to be remembered, as has been pointed out, that it was really the English who voted to take Britain out of the European Union. Scotland and Northern Ireland, and I believe Wales, but by a much smaller margin, voted to remain. The English guard their freedoms of the individual and they're more concerned about accumulation of power by central government than perhaps anybody else. They share this with Americans. We had our Civil War, we had our Glorious Revolution, but they were over by 1689. Benjamin Franklin's observation that republics are hard to keep was obviously applied to America, but he might have been applying it, for example, to continental Europe, where constitutional stability is not something which they have enjoyed for a very long time. France hasn't managed to keep its republics. It's currently on its fifth, and which has been around for somewhat less than 60 years, which is to say it has been around for less than a fifth of the time since the Glorious Revolution was over, and the British have had more or less constitutional stability since then, even though the franchise has widened. And I say this not as any kind of boast, but simply as a fact that plays into the way that the English think and explains to some extent where we are, and also to some extent, I think, where we'll go. I reject entirely the idea that those who voted leave are primarily driven, or as many critics suggest, by a sort of xenophobia, even racism. I reject the idea that this is a sort of little England pulling up of the drawbridge. It needs to be remembered that Britain, England in particular, was the most internationally minded, most free trading, most globally engaged country in the world for a quarter of a millennium before the EU existed. And there isn't any reason why it should not return to that stance rather than having a kind of siege mentality. Obviously, the world has changed greatly, but it doesn't mean to say that the attitude of the current government, and the government has already indicated it wants free trade agreements. Outside the customs union, it will be free to negotiate free trade agreements with great economies, whether that be China or the United States, where I believe negotiations are actually beginning this month. There are informal talks with Israel and India and South Korea. There will be some complications for Washington in its diplomatic relations with Europe. Obviously, it has for decades supported European integration. I think it's sort of more convenient to be dealing with a single power over there. But I think that actually that Britain outside the European Union is in some ways more valuable to Washington because outside the European Union, Britain will retain more of that sort of philosophical like-mindedness with America, with the United States, than if it is absorbed into the European Union, an ever greater union. When General de Gaulle first rejected British entry into what was then the European Economic Community, he said, and here's the direct quotation, "England in effect is insular, she is maritime, she is linked through her interactions, her markets and her supply lines to the most diverse and often the most distant countries. She pursues essentially industrial and commercial activities and only slight agricultural ones. She has, in all things, very marked and very original habits and traditions. That caused a great deal of outrage because only 14 years earlier Britain had helped liberate France, and so rejection was taken hard. But the general was right. Historically, Britain has not looked just across the channel, or even primarily across the channel, for its markets and commercial opportunities. It has looked globally. That is happening now, even though the European Union is clearly the biggest trading partner that Britain has. It used to account for, at the turn of the millennium, in the year 1 or the year 0, whatever, 2000, it accounted for 55% of British exports, British trade. It now accounts for 45%. And the rest of the world has been growing faster than the European Union, as one would expect it. The European Union countries are mostly developed. But when Britain joined the European Union, it accounted for 36% of the global economy, and now accounts for 17%. As my friend and colleague Daniel Hannan sometimes points out, Britain is the 6th largest economy in the world, the 4th most potent military power. 1.75 billion people speak English. Scores of countries have it as their first language. And he asks, obviously somewhat rhetorically, how big or how much bigger does a country have to be before it can be considered eligible to be run as an effective nation state? I think that one of the reasons why people think that Britain needs to be in a larger organization, the European Union now being that one, is that our view of what a country can be is distorted by the post-colonial lens. It needs to be remembered that the century of that Britain's hegemonic power lasted from the end of the Napoleonic Wars to perhaps the First World War, perhaps the interwar years. It was somewhat over a century, but for a considerable period, a much longer period of centuries, Britain was amongst a handful of highly effective, very creative, very entrepreneurial, very dynamic countries, very influential countries. And it is possible for a well-run country and Britain, and for Britain to be outside a larger unit and to operate as a nation state. Where do we go from here? Brexit negotiations will inevitably be turbulent. The EU has a very different agenda in many things, but not in all, from the British side in these negotiations. Even if there isn't going to be punishment, the European Union's principal negotiator, Michel Barnier, and the architects of the European Union do have a mission to use Voltaire's words, to encourage the others, and to make sure that leaving the European Union is not seen to be easy, that the distinctions between being in and being out are clear and defined and fairly sharp and not painless. We've already touched on the money that or the financial obligations that the European Union suggests Britain has. I read the number this morning of 70 billion euros, I think it was. I think it's probably inappropriate for the Foreign Secretary in Britain to suggest that the European Union can go whistle for that money. The negotiations will ultimately, I believe, be transacted on a basis of rational self-interest, but it needs to be remembered we're just starting negotiations. The second round is this week. At this stage in negotiations, people make maximal demands. They suggest or hint at bad faith, outrageous excesses on the other side. But as the two-year process unfolds, it's my expectation, certainly my hope, that rational self-interest will take hold. And the fact that Britain will become overnight the biggest export market for the European Union will encourage and will encourage the European leaders to arrive at and agree a deal. I think it was Deloitte that calculated just in the last, fairly recently, that if Britain simply drops out of the European Union without a deal and reverts to World Trade Organization rules, it'll cost 18,000 German jobs in the car making industry and car parts industry. The German car makers will be putting pressure on their government to come to a deal. I think that across the economy there will be compromises, there will be certain painful concessions, but I don't believe that the initial state of mind, which is one of doom and gloom saying, hair on fire alarms over various possibilities, is necessary. Just to cite one example, before Brexit, the Brexit vote, and immediately after, and for the past year, or for a long time of the past year, it was suggested that Britain would suffer a brain drain, that its top researchers would be fleeing the great universities of England because Britain would be outside the European research area. But Michel Barnier invited Britain to remain within that area, and it will do so. And all the alarms and scarums over that seem to me to have been unjustified. There are 2 years with two sides, both of whom have a considerable interest in arriving at a deal which prevents any wrench to their economies, and my belief is that approximately is where they will get. Thank you.
Thank you. Desmond.
Thank you, Alex. I guess a lot has already been said. What I want to focus my remarks on is as to how do we make a judgment as to whether or not Brexit has been a good thing for the United Kingdom. And before I start, I would just reminded of the apocryphal story of Chow En-lai, when he was asked for an assessment of the French Revolution that took place some 200 years ago, is supposed to have indicated that it was far too early to draw definitive conclusions. And I think that this is very true in the Brexit case. We're really only at the very start of a process. We've still got to have the negotiations. We don't know where that is going. But having said that, it seems to me that the clues are pointing in a particular direction, that this was a pretty ill-advised decision by the British. It's a major decision. It's something like Britain returning to gold in 1926 at the wrong exchange rate, or joining the European Union in the first place in 1973 was probably a wrong decision. But once one is involved in a project for 44 years with all of its complexity, disentangling oneself is rather difficult. So what I want to do is just focus my remarks on a few points. One of them is just looking at what the political fallout domestically in the UK might have been from Brexit, looking at the economics of what is likely to occur over the next few years, then make the distinction in Adam's direction, between reality and what one might have wished for. There might be a difference in that regard. And finally, I just want to say a word about what might occur in Europe, because should Europe fall apart, we judge the decision of Britain to leave in a very different way than we would otherwise. So that might be a mitigating factor as to why the decision might not have been too good. Just when I look at the UK politics, it's rather disturbing what has been going on. I don't claim to be a political analyst, but it does seem that what we've got now in Britain is a lot less stability than we had before, and prospects don't look too good. So, for instance, what we've got a minority government now. Theresa May is very dependent on the votes of a very small fringe party, which is not a good idea. The Conservative Party is deeply divided. Civil war looks like it's about to break out. One doesn't know where that is going to go. The last election, what we saw is the far left has been resurrected. We've got Jeremy Corbyn, who before the election looked like he was a lost cause. Now there's a prospect that the next election could see him against Boris Johnson, heaven help us, and that could really take Britain in a totally different direction. So all of this from a political point of view looks like it's been very disruptive, and it can take Britain down the wrong path. Meanwhile, I should mention that in France, a place that wasn't known for its political stability before, you look like you've got something new going on that could very well influence the way in which the negotiations are done. So much for the economics. Let me just turn, for the politics, let me just turn briefly to the economics and just say there the prospects don't look too good. So, for a start, what we've got is what Adam has referred to, is that the pound is already down something like 15% from where it was before. What that is doing is it's raising the inflation level in the United Kingdom, that we've now got inflation well above the Bank of England's target, calling that they're wanting already to begin raising interest rates. What it's doing is it's compressing real wages. People are now look like they're losing in terms of real wages. The cost of living is going up, the nominal wage down. They're getting squeezed. And what we're seeing is a clear slowing of the British economy, so that the economy that used to be growing at like a 2% rate looks like it's now growing at a 1% rate, and looks like it's on the decline. What my concern is that the whole of this negotiation is occurring at a time that Britain is running amongst the largest current account deficits that it's run in the post-war period. So my concern is that as the uncertainty grows about where we're going to end up in March 2019, we are going to get firms that Adam's mentioning that see their supply chain going to Europe. They're wanting to be located in the single market. They don't want to be outside. They're not wanting to run that risk. So my expectation is we're going to see investment on that side go down. Equally importantly, City of London jobs are going to be moved towards Europe. So that is likely to impact both the economy and to impact the pound. And the greater the prospect is that we get a hard Brexit, I would expect those considerations to be all the worse. So I'm just seeing real dangers on the economic side, that Britain gradually slips into recession, and it's difficult to see what is going to put it on a rapid path. Let me just mention briefly the third point that I want to make, is that there's a difference between what the UK wanted and what it's likely to get. So the whole notion of getting out of Europe from an economic point of view would be that one would free oneself from the shackles of over-regulation in Europe. One could return to one's glorious past, free market economy, low taxes, low spending, everything in a more market, open kind of way. But the reality is what I'm seeing, which is of concern, is that Theresa May has shifted distinctly to a left position. The Conservative Party manifesto was hardly a ringing document of free market economics. It was rather a question that we really have to be concerned, have a softer kind of Conservative Party, have more social spending, stuff of that sort. It wasn't the idea of we're now free of the shackles, let's move in a particular direction. And then we've got Jeremy Corbyn, who is wanting to take us back to the 1970s. So it raises a question of what are we gaining? You know, we've got all the downside of investment falling off, markets being lost. We had beforehand, we had the free currency. Now we might be moving in a different direction. What is there to have been gained by this endeavor? The last point I'd want to make is, for me at least, the European story is far from over. Europe might indeed not hold together. You know, that certainly Europe is currently now in recovery, but many of the problems that Europe had before, I'm thinking particularly of Southern Europe in general, and I'm thinking of Italy in particular, they've still got massive problems with public debt, with problems of competitiveness, with problems of weak banking systems. They show practically no growth, you know, that there's a very big divide between the North and the South in terms of growth. You know, just for instance, Italy's per capita income today is below where it was some 20 years ago, you know, which makes one wonder, you know, however they're going to get out of their debt mountain. So one can't exclude the possibility that sometime down the road we'll find this whole European project coming apart, in which case, you know, Britain's decision to have left now might prove to be as wise as the decision in the 1930s to leave the gold standard before the whole gold standard came apart, you know, to get out first. That is the only argument that I can see in favor of Britain having decided to take this path. But otherwise, I think that the economic arguments really point to a direction that Britain is going to be in for a lot of tough slogging going forward. And it might be in the interest of some countries, you know, that countries that are vying to get the City of London to move to their parts, to not be particularly flexible in this negotiation. So there's a real danger on both sides that we could be heading to a very hard Brexit that I would think would have very serious consequences for the UK economy, and those who voted for Brexit might be having buyer's remorse. Thank you.
Thanks, Desmond, and thanks to all the panelists for a series of really interesting and, needless to say, varied perspectives. I'd like to give the panel a chance, 2 minutes, maximum 3 minutes, to add anything, react to anything, clarify anything. We'll just go in the same order as we went down the panel. So, John, additional comments?
Well, I'd say three things right off the top. First, it is entirely rational for a person to say, I am prepared to risk or even endure a lower standard of living for more political freedom. That, to me, is a sensible trade-off. I think you can make a lot of assumptions about what the economic prospects are going to be. I think some here today have been overstated. But I think political control over your life is an important value. Second, a lot of statements were made about what the European Union did. And let's take the Germans and the French and the reconciliation project. You could have that reconciliation without the European Union if the French and the Germans wanted it. And what was the fundamental reason? The fundamental reason that the German course since 1945 was toward reconciliation with Europe was the presence of the American army on the territory of West Germany. Not a sparrow fell in Germany from 1945 in terms of any potential military or fascist political tendency that we didn't know about. So let's remember what happened when German reunification came. Britain wasn't in favor of it. France wasn't in favor of it. Russia wasn't in favor of it. And many West Germans weren't in favor of it. So we'll accept Europe's thank you for that. And then finally, I was glad to hear today that everything's just fine in the European Union. There's no currency problem. There's no problem in the banking system in Italy. I would say even if the ship is not sinking, it is listing heavily. And if I were a Brit, I'd say this is the time to go, because it only gets worse later.
Thanks. David?
On the, I yield to no one in my admiration for the enlightened U.S. statesmanship after the Second World War and the way in which enlightened American statesmen sought to win the peace after the victory of the war, contrary to what we all did in 1918. It was remarkably enlightened, and we in Europe owe a great debt, not just for the lives of your servicemen and servicewomen who twice in the last century intervened to help preserve freedom and democracy in Europe. We respect that. And I also yield to no one, John, in my respect for the involvement of the US in the process of European integration and in keeping peace and freedom on the European continent after the war. I accept that. But I think you do us an injustice by not accepting what we also did ourselves. And the extent to which we built a new way of doing business in Europe, a new business model for Europe, which was in contradiction to the way in which we had managed the first half of the 20th century, which led us to 2 world wars, which were European civil wars, to be frank. That's how it started. They were European civil wars which mutated into global conflicts. And we put an end to that. And I think the European Union played an important part in that. I think I made it clear in my opening remarks. I was not claiming exclusive responsibility for it, but I think it played a very important part. And by the way, it played a very important part elsewhere. It's a mistake to focus only on France and Germany. Hugely important. I pointed out how it brought reconciliation between Ireland and the UK. And with respect to Hugo, I absolutely agree with a lot of what you said about the history of Britain, but you will remember that as an Irishman, I see your history from a slightly different perspective. And I don't think you always stood for freedom or the right of independence, because we spent 700 years trying to get out from under the yoke of the United Kingdom. And when we did, joining the European Union was the ultimate expression of our independence. It was not the sacrificing of our independence, it was an expression of our independence that we would finally be able to join a community of nations on the European continent that would work together in harmony and with respect for the equality of individual countries and respect for culture and the language and our differences. It is unity in diversity. It is not a pluribus unum, which is what you have built here in the United States. So I think the European Union has achieved a huge amount. With regard to the fact that we have problems, yes, indeed. I've been here for 3 years. The US has some problems. I could list it if you wish. I don't think it's my job to do that as the EU ambassador. I'd rather have to say what a great relationship we have. But look, who doesn't have problems these days? The issue is how do we deal with them and how do we confront them? And I think the European Union has actually done a very good job of dealing with our issues over the last 10 or 15 years since the financial crisis came. We face multiple challenges. I agree with you. But ultimately, we find better solutions working together than trying to solve them separately. And that's the lesson that we have learned. Now, how we do that precisely, by the way, it is not over-regulation. One of the things I get criticized for when I travel around Europe, I'm accused as someone in Brussels as being a deregulator. People say, oh, why do you want to dismantle all these rules and everything? Because in fact, in building the European Union, what we have built is a single regulated space. So yes, we have European Union regulations, but by and large, they have replaced 28 sets of regulations, which created artificial barriers between our countries. So I don't think that the European Union, I think the European Union has a good future. If you look, support for the European Union has peaked in every other of the 27 member states and is now significantly, even in some countries, in 70, 80% of support. I think our citizens get the message that we can do things better, working jointly and sharing and pooling some sovereignty in other areas, while at the same time retaining our distinctive individual national characteristics and a large degree of control over our national space in terms of the economy and the type of society we want to build. And I respectfully, Desmond, I think, yes, Italy is an issue, but I well remember President Barroso telling me that during the height of the financial crisis, he convened 20 chief economists from banks around Europe. And at the end of the breakfast, he asked them, how many of you think the euro will still exist at the end of the year? Only one person put up their hand. 5, 6 years later, the euro is still there. It's not going to go away. We will make it work. We will find solutions to our problems. And Europe is still one of the best places in the world to live. We have a very high standard of living, high standard of education, high health care. Europe is a good place to live, and that's perhaps the source of our greatest problem, which is the migration and the refugee asylum, because people actually want to come and live in this wonderful European Union. Thank you.
Thank you. Adam?
My wife taught me not to roll my eyes while on a panel, but unfortunately, Ambassador O'Sullivan's last comment exceeded my control. I was sitting at the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England while the European crisis was going on. I was in touch with all of these so-called chief economists. Desmond knows the tribe well. What they say to the president of the EU or in a meeting is not what matters. What matters is what they bet. And billions of dollars were bet on a euro breakup. I take the opposite side of the bet, and I've advised people betting real money not to bet that. But for you to say a story like that is just nonsense. We were prepared.
Sorry. Can I correct myself? What I may have said, I'm very sorry. What I meant to say is that only one person thought the euro would survive. That was sorry. I beg your pardon. I now realize I may have. We spoke earlier about misspeaking. Yes, but the story is that 19 of them thought the euro would not survive.
Fine. Then I withdraw.
So I apologize.
Yes, that's okay. So they weren't lying to Barroso. Good. Okay. Let me move on quickly. Sorry. I do want to second Ambassador O'Sullivan on some of the pushback on Ambassador Bolton about who's responsible for what. And it also, I think, is instructive for today. In September 1992, I was sitting in Chancellor Kohl's office the day the UK dropped out of the exchange rate mechanism, okay? This was an accident of history that I happened to be there. It had no effect on anything, I can assure you, but I was there, okay? And so there are two important lessons from my having sat there that day that I would apply to today's discussion. The first is Kohl, like Merkel now, is about German self-interest. They may like the automakers, they may like the ideal of Europe, and as David has argued, they view that as in Germany's enlightened self-interest. But they are not going to just roll over for this, that, or the other, as has been seen repeatedly throughout the European crisis. And so when Ambassador Bolton is introduced as someone fighting in the bio, I think you read out, fighting vociferously or some other word for American national interest, the Germans, chancellors, fight pretty hard for German interest. And Helmut Kohl was perfectly content to watch the UK go bye-bye. That was a call from John Major. He left the room. He came back in the room, offered me a piece of cake. Kohl, like me, was a little overweight. And I said, well, you know, what? And he's like, no, it's up to Britain. They want out, they get out. That was September 92, the exchange rate mechanism. So don't overdo the idea that Chancellor Merkel or the Germans or the Europeans are going to be cowed because a few German auto workers may be out of work. Remember, 18,000 employees is 1/20th of 1% of the German workforce. And there's huge overcapacity in the auto industry. Second point is about this issue of, is there going to be a UK-US trade deal? Again, this is one of those things where there's no question President Trump and the Trump administration has the power, has the right, if they choose to tear up the queue or the Disney line or whatever's the American way of saying you sequence things. They want to have start a trade deal with US-UK tomorrow, they can. Question is, should it happen, will it happen? Should it happen? The Trump administration turned its back on the TPP deal, which, as my colleague John Hamry, president of CSIS, pointed out at Peterson yesterday, was the single biggest strategic thing the US could have done to support its allies and stop Chinese influence in Asia. And you're going to argue that this is somehow a strategic priority because we have some affinity with the stuff on Masterpiece Theater. You can do that. And in fact, it probably wouldn't surprise me if the Trump administration did that, but it's hardly pursuing US strategic interests to just piss off, excuse my language, to annoy the largest economic bloc in the world. I don't see what the point is. especially if the Trump administration's trade attitude, as expressed in its statements yesterday about NAFTA, is what they care most about are bilateral trade deficits, and they want to press bilateral strength and advantages wherever they can. Okay then, so you're going to give the UK a trade deal in which you bully them to make sure that they are importing more from the US than they're exporting. And what purpose will that serve? Don't know. Maybe it'll be a big victory and make up for the fact that Mexico isn't going to import more from the US as a result of NAFTA. You know, it's just, you can do it, but it doesn't make any sense strategically or economically. And there was a sense in which TPP, as I think Bob Zellick argued, TPP was a template. Ambassador O'Sullivan mentioned the idea of templates being useful in trade negotiations. If we had TPP, the US had specifically made sure that TPP, even though it had a geographic title in its name, had no limits on geographic membership. So we could have just extended TPP membership to the UK. It would have been at all the standards that we would have wanted from anybody. It would have been totally open to them. It would have given them access not just to the US, but to all these growing Asian markets, as Mr. GURDON mentioned, that those are where the growth is. But of course, we threw that away.
Time. Thank you.
Alex, can I
Good
just jump in,
comments.
because I just want to make one small point on TPP, which we've just heard a lot about. Hillary Clinton also said she would take the United States out of TPP.
And I publicly said that was stupid at
Think
the
she was
time.
lying?
No, not at all. I just think it was stupid.
So both presidential candidates, Democrat and Republican,
Absolutely.
advocated getting out of TPP. And fortunately, unfortunately for you, Hillary didn't win. But really, that's a kind of, well, anyway, that's fine.
There we go.
I publicly criticized the Hillary campaign and the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton for that stance. So I don't know why you say fortunately for me. I was on their list, their negative list, just like on Peter Navarro's negative list. Don't make stuff up.
Thank you both for the good interchanges. Hugo.
The point I want to make is that despite obvious disagreements on various things, there seems to be agreement across the panel. There is a clear distinction between Brexit and the kind of government that you have in Britain. Everybody, I think, has agreed that Britain has the right to withdraw. The disagreement is over whether that's a good idea. The point that I want to make is Britain outside the European Union, whether getting out is a good or a bad decision, I approve of the decision, but thereafter every other decision in government can be bad and it can be good. We can have a terrible immigration policy or we can have a terrific one. We can be sensible, we can be foolish. I think that it has been short-sighted and foolish of conservatives to believe that Jeremy Corbyn is so evidently unsuitable as the leader of any country that he will never be prime minister. I think there's a very real danger of that. And so Brexit doesn't by any means stop Britain from being badly governed, and it doesn't stop Britain from being well governed. And I think the point that Mr. O'Sullivan mentioned about people complaining around Europe that Brussels is a deregulator kind of goes to that point. Brussels has set governors on the member states. There are budgetary disciplines, etc., that have been imposed. Stopping people from spending massively and going and having caps on deficits, etc., has stopped some bad government. When Britain is out of the European Union, there's every chance of returning to the 1970s Britain and governing badly. There is also, however, that will, however, be the decision of the country. The governments will be elected democratically. The people can elect those who will govern us badly and ruin the country. They can elect people who will govern well and create a thriving economy. But at least the decision will be that of the people who actually live there.
Thank you. John, I know you have to slip out. You have one more parting shot on your way. Okay, Desmond?
Yeah. I just want to pick up on the point of economics and politics, and I would think that our experience should be that the two are not necessarily divorced. If you get very bad economics, you get a very deep recession, you get very high unemployment, you get a lot of dissatisfaction. I would have thought that that heightens the possibility that you're going to get a government at an extreme that is not really going to be good for the country. So, the notion that you're trading of freedom for economics, I see the two as perhaps linked. If we have a very bad Brexit, drives the economy into a deep recession, the probabilities are that you're going to get the Jeremy Corbyns trying new policies that actually were tried in the 70s that'll really lead the country to a bad path. The other point I want to make is, the economic performance. I want to pick up what John was saying about the economic performance in Europe. I would distinguish between what happened in the early part of the European Union and the part after the euro. So maybe the first 30, 40 years were just fine. They were glorious years, rapid growth, rapid prosperity. The story hasn't been too good over the last 10 years. Europe has barely regained its level it was before the crisis. And if you look at places like Italy, places like Spain, they're something like 5 or 6% below. So we've really got real economic problems in Europe that haven't gone away. My last point is just with the euro and its survival. I would say that that has been in no small part, not that Europe has really resolved a lot of the imbalances that were really tearing it apart. If I look at, for instance, Italy, debt levels still very high, competitive levels still very bad. But what changed was the ECB in July of 2012 saying that it would do whatever it took. The ECB buying 60 billion euros worth of bonds a month makes a difference. You can paper all of this over with a lot of money. The issue now, the reason that I'd be concerned now is that the crisis has morphed to a country like Italy, which in my view is too big to fail. That is the third largest country in the Eurozone. Without Italy, the whole euro comes apart. But it's also too big to save, because it's not this mere $100 billion here, $100 billion there that saved Greece. We're talking about real money now. We're talking about trillions of dollars that would be involved. And I'm not sure that, should you get a real crisis in Italy, that they are going to be so easily bailed out.
Thank you. Before we come to the questions, we're going to give the panelists maximum 1 minute each for a final thought here. And John?
Well, again, I just want to thank everybody for coming here. I think you need to give the British people some credit. And that is that they did not make a racist, xenophobic decision. They made a decision looking at their culture, their history, and their well-being down the road. And they saw in Brussels an increasingly unaccountable, unrestrainable bureaucracy. It's a very important statistic that the British Parliament in recent years, when it considered economic legislation, 60% or more was simply ratifying agreements that were made in Brussels, as opposed to being freely decided upon by the Parliament. And that was seen, and I think rightly, as a diminution in British liberty. It makes entirely good sense to me to cast your future in a way that puts the people in charge of their own government instead of being at the behest of somebody else. I think that's what they've done. I don't think you can predict with confidence at this stage. It was a risky move, but I think fortune favors the bold, and I think they will come to believe this was a very important and positive decision.
Thank you. 1 minute each. Continued. David?
2 quick points. On the point of prosperity and economic progress, I think the European Union has been a vehicle for all our member states to improve their economic performance. The crisis of recent years, frankly, dates from the financial crisis in 2008. which, as you know, had its origins here, mutated across the Atlantic, created a crisis in Europe, created a sovereign debt crisis, exposed, I willingly admit, weaknesses in the architecture of economic union, which we've had to repair. We have addressed many of those issues, not all of them, I absolutely agree, not all of them. But the fact is that we are now experiencing positive growth. We're now into our 16th quarter of positive growth in all member states, including in the Eurozone. Unemployment is coming down, and we are slowly turning a corner. And I think there are grounds for optimism, not complacency, but optimism that we can continue on that path with the kind of policies we've been following. To Ambassador Bolton's point, if I may, on the issue of democracy, I utterly reject the notion that Brussels imposes things on people in our member states. Brussels is the member states. It is the Council of Ministers, directly elected members of governments who vote on behalf of their governments. Every decision is taken by a vote of Council of Ministers, of directly elected ministers representing the member states. The directly elected European Parliament is a co-decision maker, directly elected members of the European Parliament by all of our citizens. It is nonsense to say that Brussels is some abstract place where people like me, unelected civil servants, take decisions. I have never taken a decision in my life that has affected the people of Europe. I have served politicians who have taken those decisions, meeting in Brussels, working together in the best interests of our common endeavor. That is how we take decisions. It's remarkably similar to how you do it here, and it is sometimes as unloved as what you decide here is. But that is the fact. It is a democratic structure.
Thank you, Adam.
First, I want to strongly support and associate myself with Desmond's response to Mr. GURDON on the idea that this isn't neutral. It isn't neutral in two senses. One, strongly echoing Desmond, that as I predicted a year and a half ago, or you can read my column from the FT from a year ago, June 26th, in which I said the dangers of an offshore Britain are that economic desperation will lead to races to the bottom and lead to bad favoring of industries and all these other things, which we know, as Desmond rightly points out, promote populism. The second thing, which I'll say, even if not implicating anyone else, which I directly contradict Mr. GURDON, is it is naive at best to pretend that there is no racial component to this. If you look at the voting patterns in the UK, there is a very strong, statistically significant positive correlation between the diversity of the voting districts and the share that voted for Brexit. Full stop. It's almost a sufficient statistic to explain the vote. And you can say, well, that's something else, but I'm afraid I tend to look at facts. The final thing I would say, and I don't get into the process stuff like Ambassador O'Sullivan did. Let's talk about effects. For anyone who's talking about the freedom of Eastern Europe or the freedom attained by US military preventing, and the NATO preventing Soviet incursions, talking about the transition to democracy in Spain and Portugal and Greece, as Ambassador O'Sullivan rightly did, or the US past, to talk about somehow political oppression of people in Britain in the last 20 years is shameful. All of you have seen, there is no meaningful political oppression. Again, you can decide as a British citizen that the symbols of what you vote on are very important to you. Legally, that's your right. But let's not gussy this up as though this is some great blow for freedom. We have all seen in our lifetimes what's going on. We are all seeing what's happening in Poland and Turkey right now, and Venezuela. That's oppression. There's nothing the EU is doing to oppress the people of the UK.
Thank you. Hugo?
I'm not sure I made quite the points that were being rebutted there, but anyway.
That's a problem we always have, all of us.
I think that the final point that I would want to make is that I would actually perhaps quote Wolfgang Schäuble, who was the finance minister in the first two Merkel governments, who before the vote last 23rd of June, a year ago, said that a vote to leave was a vote against the single market. He said that there is no hard Brexit, there's no soft Brexit, you're in or you're out. The country knew what it was voting for. At least, this is not to pretend that everybody is an economist, but it is to say that the vote was taken with eyes open, and that if Britain comes to a deal which keeps Britain under the jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice, inside the single market, it will be a denial of the democracy that was exercised a year ago. And I'm optimistic about not necessarily the long-term or medium-term economic results. I'm optimistic about deal being done and enlightened self-interest being the principal motive force over the course of the next 2 years.
Thank you. Desmond.
I guess the only point I'd make is that Brexit could take very many different forms, and it wasn't very useful that Theresa May kept saying that Brexit is Brexit. That really didn't enlighten us very much. But I'm not sure that all of the voters who voted for Brexit were in favor of the hard Brexit that seems to be pushed by Mrs. May, and I think that is really where we're going to have divisions. I don't believe that people possibly understood, what hard Brexit is, what it really would entail, how much Britain will suffer, if you really go in that direction. And I think that this is really what's motivating a lot of the discussion and a lot of people having second thoughts about whether this was the right thing to do.
Thank you. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to come to your questions. Let me ask you please to wait for the microphone. Then when you get it, tell us who you are and what your affiliation is, and then ask your question. I know on such an interesting topic there is a huge urge to give a little lecture yourself. However, the chair will give you a maximum of 1 minute and then indicate to you, should you succumb to this temptation, when your question has to start. I have a first question right here. Wait for the microphone, please. Here we have it. It's coming here.
Barry Wood, RTHK in Hong Kong. What happens if all those economic difficulties come to pass, which seems reasonable to me? If the British people then elect a government that wants to reverse all this, can that actually occur?
Thank you.
It would depend on the moment, I suppose. I mean, there is a debate in legal circles in Brussels as to whether, once you've introduced the request under Article 50, you can simply yourself unilaterally, the country which introduced that request can unilaterally withdraw it without everybody else agreeing. My guess is, whatever the legal niceties, if a country which initially said we'd like to withdraw turned around and said we've changed our mind and now we'd like to say, before you have finalized the exit, I guess people would be willing to have that conversation. They wouldn't be very happy, but they'd probably be willing to have the conversation. If you do it after the exit, well then I'm afraid I don't think you can just reverse it. Then you have to reapply, or you have to start the process of joining the EU probably again. So it would depend on the time frame. But I mean, I just want to be clear, nobody in Brussels is expecting any rapid change of direction, and we are working on the assumption that the Article 29, the Article 50 notification on the 29th of March is the definitive position of the UK, and that is the direction in which we are heading.
Other comments, Desmond?
I guess I grew up in the colonies in a place called South Africa, and they used to say in South Africa that Britannia doesn't rule the waves, it rather waves the rules. So, hopefully Britain is hoping that the same would be said of the Europeans when it comes to their wanting to change their mind on Article 50.
Other questions? Way in the back here, and then I'll come to you.
Thank you very much for a very interesting panel. My name is Richard Sassoon, retired federal sector. My question is, I understand the idea behind the Brexit, i.e. the people of Britain feeling that they were that their autonomy was being undermined as a people, as a nation, as a culture. My question is, perhaps for Mr. O'Sullivan, Ambassador O'Sullivan, what do you see as a possible remedy for that sense of alienation that could be felt in other places? And this is perhaps more of a cultural as opposed to an economic question, but the sense of alienation that the British people had, is that something that could spread, perhaps for economic or other reasons? And if so, what administratively or what could the EU do to alleviate that? Thank you.
I'll try to give you a short answer. It's not easy because I do think if we were discussing the future of the European Union, that one of the issues is a certain disconnect between what happens in Brussels and what's perceived and felt by many of our citizens. There are contradictions there. If you look at the latest opinion polls, you will find that opinion in favor of the European Union in 27 member states has increased considerably and is still running, very positive levels in some countries, 60, 70, 80% of, and that coexists sometimes with people thinking they don't like what's going on in Brussels. So, I mean, we have to deal with that. I think the biggest problem we have, to be very frank, is what I call the nationalization of success and the Europeanization of failure. The tendency of national politicians, when they come back from Brussels, if a good decision has been taken, they say, "You're so lucky I was there because, they nearly decided a bad thing, but I was there and I got the best deal for you and it's a great decision and we love it." If a tough decision has to be taken, even if it's a decision that everyone agrees has to be taken in the collective best interest, ministers will come back and say, "You're not going to believe it, what they decided in Brussels. I tried my best, but I was outvoted. I couldn't do anything about it, and we're going to have to live with this terrible decision." People are not stupid. You do that 6 days a week, and you tell them that bad things come from Brussels and good things come from national politicians. You ask them on the seventh day, as Romano Prodi, my former boss as president of the Commission, you ask them on the seventh day to vote for Europe, they might be tempted to vote no. So I think we have a problem of the honesty of the debate at the national level about why we do certain things at European Union level and why it gives better outcomes than if we try to do it alone. And I do think that will be part of the challenge for the EU 27 going forward, and I think there will be a new dynamism in trying to better invent the connection between what happens in Brussels and what happens elsewhere. But I just advise you, I sometimes say here, Brussels is held in the same respect in the rest of Europe that Washington sometimes is held in the rest of the United States. It is a problem of any federal structure because there is a sense of distance, and communicating that and getting people to buy into the benefits of having continent-wide rules as opposed to deciding everything at the local or state level is not always easy. And we face that challenge, and we will face it every day.
Other comments?
I have a little bit of a political science background, so forgive me if I raise a different tack, which is referendum democracy is not the only way to do democracy. There's a reason why the US was a republic. There's a reason why in Britain, even though they've chosen to ignore it now, Parliament is sovereign, not the popular vote. The popular vote is binding in the political sense, but is in no sense legally or constitutionally binding in the UK. So, putting it differently, a poll just came out in the German press that a third of Bavarians would like to secede from Germany. I think it came out yesterday in Die Zeit. No, in Die Welt. You don't want elected officials or the appointees of elected officials completely ignoring popular opinion, but there's a reason why constitutions get drawn up with less degrees of responsiveness to popular opinion.
I
would just say that the creation of the United States of Europe, the European Union, faces and always has faced very much greater challenges than, for example, the United States of America. It has always been difficult to make people to take on in Antrim to believe that they have much in common with people in Athens. And there wasn't a single language there now is a single currency. There are widely diverse cultures. And so whatever the merits of the European Union, it has been, I think, a very difficult thing for either those who support it or the various constituent governments to convey a sense of unity of purpose to people that are so widely divergent. And I don't know, obviously, what will happen, but it seems to me that the sort of vociferous forces that are in the are in continental Europe and in Britain, have not gone away. Perhaps they have been eroded. Perhaps there is a greater sense now of union. But I don't think that the danger of other countries feeling that they would like to leave has gone away. And I don't know, I can't remember which countries it is, but I believe there are several countries in which, even if they support membership of the European Union, they would also, in their most recent polls, and polls over the last year, have suggested they would also like a referendum to be able to decide. And I can't vouch for whether I'm completely up to date on those polls, though.
Okay, thank you. I have a question right here, please.
Hi, thank you all. I'm Sarah Usher. I'm from the University of Oxford. And I had a question more or less for David. It has to do with what you brought up in the first 10 to 12 minutes of your introductory talk. And you talked about how there's a lot of legal and regulation and trade laws involved with both the UK and the European Union. And this deadline of March 2019 to untangle all these laws, in addition to a lack of, it seems to be, trade lawyers within Europe, or within the United Kingdom, is that a realistic timeline? Do you think you'll actually see a complete clean break from the European Union by 2019? There just seems to be thousands of pages of law and regulation. I don't see how that can kind of come to an agreement by the 2019 deadline.
Well, leaving is easy. Let's be clear. That's the easy bit. But it's putting in place the alternatives and the sort of ensuring the transition, and that's why I do believe that I noticed that in the UK there's a growing debate about transition. I mean, you're absolutely right. I don't think we can solve all the problems of Brexit in 2 years. It's probably insurmountable. My own guess is that the UK will probably do nothing but Brexit for about 10 years from now, just putting together all the pieces. I saw one study which said they would have to recruit probably 30,000 extra civil servants just to try and manage all the stuff. By the way, there's only 33,000 civil servants in Brussels. So I think it is a vast undertaking for the UK. I think the key is transition. I don't think we can solve everything. So that's why we have said the sequencing should be, firstly, to sort out some of the upfront problems. Secondly, to try and get a fix on where we want to go in the future. Is that completely exiting the single market and the customs union, and therefore a free trade deal as embodying the new relationship? Well, then we need to discuss the transition, because a trade deal is not going to be doable in 2 years, or even, in my view, 3, 4, 5 years. So then everything comes down to the transition and what kind of transition we can orchestrate, and that will raise some sensitive issues, as Hugo has mentioned, for the UK in terms of continued rule of the Court of Justice, or budget issues, or freedom of movement issues, because the transition will not simply be for the UK to define, it will have to be agreed mutually. So there will be some, but I mean, I think everything, in my view, ultimately comes down to some kind of sensible transition which enables us to move from the full membership of the European Union, which the UK currently has, to a future relationship which will be defined by, say, a comprehensive trade deal. And then the issue is, how do we get from A to B in a way that has minimum disruption, both for the UK and its economy and for the EU 27. But it won't be simple.
More questions? Right here, please.
Hi, thank you very much for the stimulating discussion. I'm Lila Afas with Toyota. I think one of the interesting impacts of Brexit was that you saw the pound devalue immediately, and typically in economics theory that leads to an increase in exports, but we haven't seen that happen. And a lot of the cause for that, many suspect, is because of the global supply chains, and although the pound may be lower, Britain still relies upon so many components. What other impacts do you think coming out of Brexit will sort of defy traditional economic theory? And also, Adam, as you said, the withdrawal was a protectionist measure. What other protectionist measures may the UK look at to protect itself, given the prognosis that you provided, and other things that they might do, or other mechanisms they may put in place as well?
Okay, I think that's, yes.
Thank you. So I want to provide a tiny bit more context to this. You're absolutely right, Lila. There is this weird phenomenon of pound declined a lot, and the trade gap in the UK hasn't appreciably changed much. But actually, when I was in the UK, we saw a similar thing at the start of the crisis, where the trade-weighted pound declined by 25% roughly, and over the course of 2008, over the course of 2009. And the trade gap didn't change very much. And at the time, the staff at the Bank of England, and I was kibitzing on that, was very concerned by this because it seemed weird. And what we decided at the time as a tentative explanation was there were several factors. One was what you mentioned, that the UK is at a high intermediate point in a lot of supply chains. So whether it's autos or expertise on oil extraction or various, even financial services of certain kinds, they require a bunch of inputs, literally imported inputs, whether it's people or car parts, before they can be exported. And so the net gain you get is limited. And the same is true of Japan, and we see this in Japan, that the decline in the value of the yen in recent years has not had as big an impact as we expected. A second point is that there was a secular hit, meaning a lasting targeted problem for the financial services industry. The financial services industry in the UK was at its height about 15% of GDP. It's now down to fluctuating between 10 and 12%. That's a very big change for a major economy, and very sudden. And this had to do with the combination of the financial crisis, scandals and problems within the UK, over-reliance on this, and now, of course, compounded by the shift of some of those financial services to Ireland, Germany, Netherlands, wherever. And so that's something that the exchange rate isn't going to entirely make up for. So it's less a phenomenon, I think, of economic theory not working, and more a phenomenon of the usual economist's excuse, and I'm sure the non-economists on the panel can make fun of this, That's true, ceteris paribus, everything else equal, not everything else was held constant. But in this case, that's what's happening. Let me turn to Desmond.
Before I go on to Desmond, your very interesting question makes me think of the great statement attributed to Yogi Berra, which is, in theory, theory and practice are the same, and in practice, they're not.
Yeah.
Desmond.
No, I'd just add to Adam's point that the non-responsiveness of UK exports to the exchange rate really has to be very troubling, because if the UK is running a very large current account deficit that requires a lot of money to come in to keep the pound where it is, if that money for any reason dries up because people are worried about not having passporting rights to Europe or not having access to the single market, then what that means is that the exchange rate has really got a lot further to fall. And that can be super disruptive. It raises prices, it reduces wages. So that's why they shouldn't be taking all of this too lightly.
Okay, we have time for one more question. Did I lose my question over? I lost my question. We have time for one more question if you have one. Right here, please.
Hi, my name is Melia Wong. I'm with the Center for American Progress. This is a bit of a personal question because I was living in Scotland last summer during the Brexit vote. So I'm wondering if any of you could envision a future where Scotland would have a second referendum, vote to leave, and then try and join the EU.
Well, before my colleagues answer, I will tell you I can envision the past, because there used to be something called the Auld Alliance, which was the alliance of Scotland and France against England, needless to say. Now, but that's the past. How about the future? Any comments?
This is a place where I think John Bolton was absolutely right. I have a lot of friends in Scottish politics, and it was just an incredible shock to everyone how badly the SNP did, Scottish National Party did, and Hugo will know better than I can. But there's no way to interpret that as supporting a referendum. It just, we all have a tendency to talk too much, me more than anybody else, but just full stop. I just can't see how you go beyond that.
I would agree with that. I think the election was a very dramatic repudiation of the idea that Scotland would not just fall out of the European Union, but also out of the United Kingdom. Conceivable that it might happen at some distant point in the future, but I think that it's a busted flush right now.
Thank you, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you for being with us, and let's show our appreciation for the panel and its excellent comments.